Hey everyone, so in today's video what I wanted to do was take a look at what comes next in terms of OLED TVs. So obviously the difference between the C9 and the C10, as I discussed many times previously, wasn't great enough for me to justify basically upgrading from the C9 to the C10. And in some parts there was a lot of things that, especially hardware wise, were perhaps a downgrade, but LG, as well as many other manufacturers this year, managed to make up for any hardware downgrades using software essentially. So we saw with LG, obviously they downgraded the HDMI 2.1 ports from 48 down to 40, mainly because they feel that basically they weren't ever going to use the 48, so it didn't make sense actually installing the extra 48 gigabit ports when 40 would do and would save them cost, which, looking at it, perhaps they did actually pass on to the consumer, because prices for the CX series has already come down to the point where the C9 didn't come down till basically until after the CX had already been released. And in some instances the C9 actually went up further in price because it was actually outselling the CX. Samsung did a similar thing with reducing the dimming zones on the Q90T and all the other T series TVs for this year. But at the same time, most reviews actually state that they probably did a better job in terms of software, which actually made up. And whether that says how bad the 2019 TVs were with more dimming zones that weren't controlled in the right way, or whether it states that their technology is obviously advanced to the point where they can make use of fewer dimming zones but still have an improved overall picture. Either way, it's the same result. Basically you ended up with a better TV, even though hardware wise they were both worse. Now in terms of 2021, obviously there's been reports already that the naming scheme is changing. So rather than going from C10 to C11 or CX to CX1, or even straight to back to numbers again to C11, we're dropping down to basically B1, C1, G1, W1 and Z1. Probably a number of reasons, but whenever a company does something like that, normally it would suggest a refresh. So dropping down from C9, C10 down to C1 would suggest that they're doing something that is drastic enough to warrant a refresh. So in terms of, if you think of smartphones, it's a super cycle. So it's when they change the design, they change the look of the phone. So it's not an S year, it's an actual upgrade year, a new design year. And obviously there's a few reports already. Everything will be a little bit sketchy at this time, more so than in previous years, mainly because of the fact that basically tech industry as a whole, you don't have people going around, you don't have the events in the same way, you don't have those sort of in-person meetings, if you like, where people can get an insight into what's coming next, as we had in years gone by. But even still, there are certain things that you can glean from basically just patents and things like that, and obviously this is one of them. So the naming structures obviously come from the fact that they've had to register certain trade names for CES 2021, and even if the event itself doesn't happen in the normal terms that we understand it, in terms of people attending a conference, I believe from early reports that CES 2021 will still happen. It will just probably be an online event as opposed to being people actually attending it. And from that, obviously, we gather the new naming structure. So you've got B1, C1, G1, W1, R1 and Z1. So maybe a couple of new ones thrown in there, and then a couple other things. So obviously one of the only other things that they've sort of trademarked, if you like, is Oled Modion Motion. I'm not sure what that's meant to be, but it's basically their 120 Hz black frame insertion, which, from what I've seen on the CX or the C10, it was much improved over the C9. On the C9, basically, black frame insertion isn't really usable for me. There are people out there that have said that in the past that they do use BFI whilst gaming and even just for sports and things like that. For me personally, at 60 Hz, it's not usable. At 120 Hz, from what I've seen, it's a bit more usable, but I've never seen that in person, so I can't say for sure. But obviously it does dim the picture quite a bit, so it does involve you changing quite a lot of settings if you're like me, where you've dimmed down your OLED light because basically you don't want that brightness blasting at you constantly. Black frame insertion, as the name suggests, is inserting a black frame between every single one, and obviously the frequency is determined by the model. So obviously on the C9 you could only do 60 Hz BFI, so it was a little bit slower, whereas 120 Hz as we got on the CX was fast enough to the point where it dims the screen but you don't really notice the flicker as much. So whether that is anything new between the CX and the C1, whether they're changing the technology, whether they're somehow managing to bump the brightness up automatically so you don't then have to go in and manually do it when it's enabled, who knows, we'll have to wait and see. But other than that, obviously the only other real rumour mill is that the pixel layout is supposedly changing. So they're going from a WRGB to a RBWG, and this is similar to what they did on their 8K models. So obviously when it's slightly different with LED TVs, but LED TVs are a good example in this, where whenever you bump up to the next resolution scale, so when you're going from 4K to 8K, in order for that 8K TV, and it will be a similar thing with OLED as well, when you're adding in more pixels in the same screen size, the only thing you can do is shrink the pixel size in order to fit in those extra pixels. Now, in order for that to happen, those pixels have to then get brighter, which otherwise, basically, if you think about squeezing more pixels into the same space, it's similar to what smartphone photography more or less stumbled upon after the megapixel race had kind of calmed down. So when smartphone photography first started kicking off, you had all the Sony sensors and all these smartphone manufacturers out there that were just rushing to get to 100 megapixels, and they just assumed that more megapixels was a better image. But what they weren't really thinking about was the basics of photography, which is light, and in order to get more light in, you need a bigger pixel size. So you actually benefited, as we see with the iPhones, where even with 12 megapixel sensors, they're able to produce better photos and video than phones out there with double, triple, or even 4 times as many megapixels on their sensors. And the main reason for that is they're being able to bring in more light. So it's a very similar thing with the TV panels and obviously resolution as well. At the moment, obviously, it's still saying that they're probably sticking to 4K on all the panels, which I don't imagine that they're going to be changing anytime soon. I think it'd probably be at least another year or two before any of the manufacturers totally went 8K across the board, and 8K OLED is just ridiculously expensive right now anyway, so I don't think that's an option for any of like the entry B, C, G, those kind of models. Possibly the Ws may get them, because obviously that's more of a sort of flagship kind of TV, but especially with the B, C and G, I would expect that they're going to stay at 4K for a number of years yet, until they can basically get that technology down in price to the point where they can actually make it competitive, and make it a feasible option for people to actually go out and buy. From this, we gather that obviously even with this same method on their 8K TVs last year, they were able to get 30% better light transmission. There are other methods out there by changing what type of substructure that they actually use in the production of the pixels themselves. I have seen other articles where they actually give a little bit more details in terms of TADF. Yeah, so here we have TADF. So it is basically thermally activated delayed fluorescence. So basically this is as it says there, a relatively new class of OLED emitter materials that promise efficient and long-lasting performance without any heavy metals. So essentially this is where they're always looking at other technologies. Everybody is usually doing that, looking at what the next step is, and obviously this is something that LG, I believe, have they taken over this, or they've basically taken on part of the research into this particular type of material. We know from CES last year or the year before. They were discussing inkjet printed OLEDs, as well as QD OLEDs as well, as it mentions further down here as well. So there are a lot of other possibilities as well in terms of what could be coming. Other things that we see further down, obviously the 21:9, that's something that I remember seeing a few years back, where some of the manufacturers actually brought out the 21:9 aspect ratio TVs, which is brilliant for movies, but the problem it gives you is black bars on every other type of content, and that's not the kind of black bars that you want, because for all other 16:9 content, and you end up with a much smaller image, similarly to how with the smartphones, when they're stretching them to taller and taller aspect ratios, it actually results in a worse viewing experience. Even if you have a 7-inch display at, say, a 22:9 aspect ratio, once you actually put a 16:9 image on that, you're going to end up with a much smaller box, and the only way to eradicate that is to stretch the image and obviously lose parts of the image. So 21:9 isn't something that I think I'm particularly interested in seeing on TVs. For projectors, yes, by all means go that route, but for TVs I don't think that's really something that is something that's appealable. And obviously the other thing that they mention here is rotating speakers as well. That's similarly, again, built-in speakers on TVs. They only suit a certain criteria. Anybody who's serious about home entertainment generally is going to have either a soundbar setup, or those that have the space for it and the money for it go full home receiver setup. And for those people, obviously having this extra clutter around the TV where you have moving speakers isn't something that I think is of interest to anybody, so I don't think that would appeal to the masses. Essentially what it comes down to is the next paragraph, where possibly the new factory might actually help bring down those prices. Especially a lot of people commented this year about how the 48-inch wasn't really very good value in comparison to the 55-inch, because it was in some instances it was only a couple of $100 depending on where you were in the world, between the 48-inch and the 55-inch. But because obviously the 55, the 65, and now obviously even the 77 has been produced for a number of years, whereas the 48-inch was a brand new size, it meant that basically they just couldn't be more competitive with the pricing. Whereas with the 77-inch, that's, I noticed this year. So last year I've been monitoring the 77-inch C9 since I first started looking at my C9, and the price of that is still around the £5,000 mark, £4,500 mark in the UK. Now I had a look on Amazon as soon as the CX came out, and that's actually dropped down to £3,500. So right now you can actually buy a 77-inch CX for £1,000 less than you can buy the C9, which it doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know why sellers didn't just drop the price on those C9 models and just get rid of them. I don't see why they keep the old stock around. I don't know whether it's something to do with replacements and possibly sending it back for manufacturers to be able to reuse for warranty claims and things like that. I don't know whether the panels can be reused, because essentially between the last 2 years especially, it is exactly the same panel. So I don't know whether they literally just take them back, strip them down, put the new mechanics of the CX on it instead of the C9 and send it out as a new TV. I don't know whether that's a possibility, but to my mind the 77-inch, if that comes down in price to the point where if you're getting towards the £3,000 mark, say retail price, and then obviously with sales and things like that possibly drop down into the twos, then that's, at that point it's something where it is it's not attainable to everybody, but it does become a lot more attainable to a lot more people. And I think that's, especially with the OLED picture, that's something that I personally would have actually really liked for where I have my TV in my room, because it is against a full wall. Even though the TV itself is quite big, it's a 65-inch, because I have a full open wall, I could potentially go up to the 77 and still have room either side. So that's something that I was always interested in, but obviously the price wise I couldn't justify paying £4,500 for the TV that could potentially get replaced somewhere down the line. So for that reason, obviously I was hoping maybe the CX 77-inch would drop down enough, or possibly, depending on what happens with the C1 next year, that's probably the more likely sort of set that I'll be looking at. potentially looking to get that as a replacement. One of my plasmas has finally given up, so it did actually, it's still working, but it's gone all funky looking on the actual screen. It had a strange pop and then switched off. When I switched it back on, it had all sorts of weird pixel shifting going on. So that has finally given up the ghost after something like 12-13 years of heavy usage. So I have room for one replacement TV right now, so hopefully LG or somebody else out there can bring something to the market next year that does entice me enough to warrant buying another one. But anyway, this is just obviously my thoughts on it. Let me know down below what you guys think about what you would most like to see. Obviously we have the obvious stuff like all the gaming features, 120Hz, 10-bit support, all the rest of it. But let me know down below what you guys want to see, and what would make you want to spend your money and possibly upgrade from either a C9, C10, or possibly even older if you have anything older, or make you want to switch from a QLED or an LED TV to the OLED technology this year.